Hello, this is Mr. D. Phillips, and this video is a part of the series on our cell and cell membrane unit, and this video is on cell communication. We have covered homeostasis and how the body regulates certain actions. Well, regulation and homeostasis can only happen through communication. Animals and their cells rely on two systems for regulation: the endocrine system and the nervous system. The endocrine system is a system of ductless glands that will secrete chemical signals directly into your bloodstream. Those chemicals will travel all throughout your body to certain target tissues. Those target cells have receptor proteins that will take up that chemical signal, and the endocrine system produces a slow, long-lasting response. The nervous system is a system of neurons. You've heard of that plenty of times before. It is a system of electrical signals and release neurotransmitters to a specific target tissue. And this is a fast, short-lasting response. And everything we'll be talking about in this video is communication based on one of these two options. Now, when we're looking at communication, even in the real world, we have long distance and local or short distance communication techniques. Your cells will do the same thing. Cells in multicellular organisms communicate by chemical messengers in one of the three following ways. Animals, and in this case plant cells, have cell junctions that directly contact the cytoplasm of adjacent cells. It's very easy for them to communicate with each other. In other cases, animal cells communicate using local regulators, messenger molecules that travel only short distances. Okay, so the local area cells are affected. And we'll talk about paracrine and synaptic messaging. And third, the endocrine system, or endocrine signaling, is a long-distance signaling, where plants and animals will use chemicals called hormones to send chemical messages to cells far away from their destination. Let's take a look at a few visual examples. Here are examples of direct contact. They are all local, obviously, because the only way to directly contact is to be in the local area. So we have an animal cell that is directly contacted. Some sort of protein or molecule made in one cell will be able to pass through the cell membrane and into the other cell. Here we have plant cells, and they have openings called plasmodesmata that we talked about in our cell membrane chapter. And again, molecules will be able to pass through the cell wall, in this case, through those openings. And another example that we have already talked about in the immune system for our immune response is one cell's protein, surface protein, interacting with a protein receptor on another cell. And if that is a B cell or a T cell, all of the actions that will occur from there will come from a direct contact messaging. And to make this a little more real world, it's like you're sending a message to one specific friend. Let's call it Snapchat. You're sending one specific message, one specific picture in this case, to one specific person. Our other examples are local examples. Here is an example of paracrine signaling, where our secreting cell has all these chemicals being made. They can be proteins, they can be hormones, or whatever else it is. And through a secretory vesicle, it'll open up and send regulators, these chemicals, to only cells in the local area. In the nervous system, that will happen through a synapse. The synapse is the space between one neuron and the next neuron. Those chemical messengers, in this case a neurotransmitter, will go across the synapse to one specific cell. Now, when we're going long distances, we need messengers to go through your blood vessels. All right, and this area here is just basically throughout your whole body. But through the blood, an endocrine system cell will secrete a hormone that'll travel through the bloodstream, going all the way through. So that is our endocrine system for long distance communication. And some real world examples here. Local signaling, paracrine and synaptic signaling, are like Facebook. You have your circle of friends. I guess Google Plus would be there if you're talking about circles. And only they are getting what you are posting. They can see it. And sometimes you can send, of course, just a message to one person as well. That's our Facebook example. For long distance signaling, you can say Twitter. Anything you say on Twitter goes to everybody on Twitter. And any hormone that is released from an endocrine system goes to every cell of the body. So there is our regulation by chemical messengers. Neurotransmitters released by neurons. There is our neurotransmitter, and they are going to bind to a receptor protein. Remember, proteins work because of their shape, and that's what we're showing you here. And hormones releasing by your endocrine glands. Here it comes through the bloodstream, through the receptor proteins, in this case in a muscle cell. And remember that lock and key system that we talked about in our chemistry unit. Proteins work because of their specific shape. This signaling molecule will not trigger this protein molecule. The shape is different. Okay. And then they will have certain effects as they go through. And we'll go over some of those examples as well. Now, we talked about different signaling molecules. We talked about different receptor proteins. And we see a word that will be new to just about all of you because we don't cover this in general biology. But we have a ligand. A ligand is a signaling molecule. Any of those signaling molecules we just talked about we'll say is a ligand. A ligand can be a protein molecule, and if you remember, this picture is going to look very familiar. As we said, proteins work because of their shape. Here's our ligand. Here's our receptor protein, and if you notice, they're going to work because of their shape. Okay, but ligands don't just have to be proteins. They can be just an individual amino acid. They can be a nucleotide. They can be a steroid or another lipid, or they can be even a dissolved gas. Right? Any of those can send a message to a cell through a receptor protein. Okay, and that receptor protein is important to remember because we don't have any message sent unless we had a signaling molecule, a ligand, and a receptor protein. And don't make it any harder than it needs to be. Okay, signaling molecule is the ligand, the receptor protein is on the receptor cell, and then that will have some sort of action. So, how do hormones act on target cells? We have two different classes of hormones, and depending on their chemical properties will tell us how they work. Lipid-based hormones and protein-based hormones. Our last unit, our chemistry unit, we've covered the chemical properties of both of these chemical compounds, both lipids and proteins. Lipids, and one word that you can use to describe a lipid that you probably remember from now, is that they are hydrophobic. They do not get along with water. They are afraid of water. They could only dissolve in other fats. Okay? So that means the fat of our cell membrane will allow this lipid-based hormone to go through, and then they will be able to enter your cell. Once inside the cell, they'll bind to a receptor protein inside the cell, in the cytoplasm and or nucleus, depending on the example. They can then bind to DNA as a transcription factor so that they can turn on your genes to do something. And there's plenty of examples, and we don't need to know them all right now. A protein-based hormone, however, is hydrophilic. They get along with water. Proteins are generally going to dissolve in water. They will not dissolve in a lipid, which means they cannot diffuse across the cell's lipid membrane. So they need to bind to receptor proteins on the surface of the cell. The receptor proteins are in the cell membrane. They will then trigger a secondary messenger pathway and activate different internal cellular responses. Let's take a look at examples. Okay. Here we have our lipid, our steroid hormones. These are our fat-soluble, our hydrophobic ones. Okay. Here is our bloodstream. Hormones will come through the bloodstream, okay, with the steroid hormone coming through. Here's our target cell all over here, okay, the plasma membrane, the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, the nucleus, all your general parts of a cell. So, first thing that's going to happen is our steroid hormone, that is lipid soluble, can pass through lipids. It'll just slip right on through the cell membrane. Here it will meet up with the receptor protein, okay? And the shapes work out, so that's fine. This receptor protein, when activated by a hormone, will then enter the nucleus. Okay? Here's a strand of DNA, and if you notice, our receptor protein and hormone, okay, is a transcription factor. It will transcribe DNA and make a strand of mRNA, messenger RNA. That messenger RNA makes its way out into the cytoplasm, and it'll be read by a ribosome so that we can put together a protein. Steps 4, 5, and 6 we're going to go over in a lot more detail when we get to our DNA unit. So don't panic if you don't remember these steps from general biology. And then that protein will be secreted from the cell and to do whatever function it is. Okay? For example, that secreted protein can be a growth factor. Okay? For hair, bone, muscle, for your gametes, for your egg and sperm cells. And that's what we have there. A protein that is made because of a hormone that is made out of a lipid that can cross into the cell membrane. Now, we also have protein hormones. Those protein hormones cannot cross the cell membrane. So once again, we have a target cell, the cell membrane, the plasma membrane, cytoplasm. The receptor protein is here embedded in the plasma membrane because this protein hormone cannot pass through the cell membrane. And it won't pass through this protein either. It's just going to send a message, and this protein will do all the work inside the cell. Okay, so there we have our signal. That binding to the receptor protein then starts a chain of chemical reactions. That cytoplasmic signal will get a whole host of things happening. GTP. Oh, that sounds like ATP. ATP is our energy molecule. Well, guanine triphosphate is similar. There's energy involved. That GTP, when activated by this receptor protein, okay, will activate a G protein. That energy will activate a G protein, GTP, G protein. They named it that way to help us out a little bit. That G protein then activates another enzyme. We need some input of energy here. Our friend ATP will add more energy into the process. And cyclic AMP, okay, will be a part of the process. The cyclic part is that it keeps getting recycled to keep this process going. And that'll act as a secondary messenger. So here is our first messenger, the signal. Now we have a secondary messenger. And that will activate an enzyme. And that will activate another enzyme. And it'll keep going down this chain of reactions. And that chain of reactions we call transduction. Okay? Transduction is just that passing of energy and that change of enzymes going down through. And again, there's a lot of different examples of this. Adrenaline is a main one that we will go over further in class. So we have a secondary messenger system here. And that'll produce an action. Okay? And like I said, one main example is adrenaline, which will have a lot of different things going on in your body when you get excited. And that is the response. So the signal is outside the cell. It passes the information on through transduction pathway, the secondary messenger system, and then we have our response. That looks really, complicated. It does get a little bit easier. And this, if you've noticed, I've kind of blocked out a couple of the words, is one of the questions on 2013's AP Biology exam. And all they asked you to do was to describe what's happening in step 1, describe what's happening in step 2, describe what's happening in step 3. So take a moment. I would say pause this video, go back a little bit, take a look at the last slide, and see if you can write up what is happening in step 1, what is happening in step 2, and what is happening in step 3. Take a second, pause the video, and come back when you're ready. Hopefully you realized it was a protein-based hormone, and then we'll go over all the rest. All right, you might think that there's a lot of weird stuff going on for all those different steps for a pretty straightforward thing. But there's a benefit to that secondary messenger, where we have that signal outside and a receptor protein activating. One word that we're going to use as the benefit of this messenger system is amplification, because it's not just one GTP activating a G protein. It'll happen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and each of those will activate another class of proteins, adenyl cyclase in this case. And then each of those will amplify and, trigger more proteins to do their job. And then it'll happen again. It amplifies again, as each of these will make 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't think there's a real number, but we're just showing that here for that CAMP. And then we're going to be able to make these protein kinases that we say are going to add a phosphate group. And then we have further amplification with each of these. And then we have further amplification as each of these comes down. So you can just imagine that every single one of these molecules has this many coming off. But then every single one of these molecules has one of these, and every one of those has one of those. We're talking amplification. We're getting a ton of response from just one signaling molecule. We'll call this a cascade multiplier. Cascade, think waterfall. It's just going to multiply over and over and over again. We get a huge response from just one signaling molecule. Such a fast response. That's when adrenaline really hits you. Your fight or flight reaction hits you so hard when your adrenaline starts pumping, when you're excited, when you're scared, when you're nervous. Because just one molecule of adrenaline will get so many different molecules going and so much product in your body that's when you get that burst of energy, that burst of just that tingly feeling you get when you have true adrenaline going. So, basically, to start summing up, regulation. Why are hormones needed? We need to pass chemical messages from one body part to another. To communicate, communication is needed to coordinate the whole body. Adrenaline would never work if it worked like a nerve, where the nerve only goes to one specific spot. And of course, we talked about the nervous system already in one of our previous sections. Regulation is important for daily homeostasis and the regulation of large-scale changes. Growth hormone, if it only was working on one muscle or one body part at a time, that'd be a really weird growth process. And adolescence is weird enough already. We don't need one body part at a time to start developing. Right? So all the other homeostatic mechanisms that we've talked about, solute levels in blood, talking about anything from calcium to glucose, to different salts, your metabolism, your growth, your development, your maturation, all of those things you want to happen large scale all at the same time so that nothing, goes wrong in one specific area of the body. And reproduction, of course, once you choose to in the future. So, tying the nervous and endocrine systems together, right? The hypothalamus is the master nerve control center right there in your brain. Hypothalamus is part of the nervous system. It will receive information from nerves around the body about its internal conditions. And it releases hormones, regulates the release of hormones from the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus and the pituitary glands are linked very closely by both direct contact and by nerves. Okay, very small part of the brain blown up here. The pituitary is your master gland, part of the endocrine system, which will then secrete a broad range of trophic hormones regulating other glands in the body, going to different, the glands itself, because the pituitary doesn't release every single hormone that you need. It will regulate all the other glands to secrete those other hormones. And that sums up that portion of it. Please remember the ligand is the chemical messenger. The receptor proteins are important. Okay? And those hormones are chemical messengers that will go all throughout the body for that long-lasting response. And when something happens with those hormones, especially a growth hormone, well, hey, you can grow to pretty tall heights. Unfortunately, other body systems start to fail. He died at a very young age, at the age of 32. But 8'11" tall, the largest man ever, because of a growth on his pituitary gland. And this hormone action got a little out of balance. And we'll talk about the exceptions to the endocrine system's workings in class as well. So if you have any questions, please make sure to jot them down and talk to me in class. But for now, I hope you understand a little bit more about how cells will communicate.